Good afternoon. My name is O.J. Hall. I'm truly honored to have the privilege to talk to you here today. When I was approached about giving this speech, I thought to myself, what things do I have that people might want to hear? And the first thing that popped in my head was, I got a pretty good bear hunting story. But nobody really wants to hear about that right now. So then I thought, what things have I done in my life? What experiences have I had that maybe many of you haven't? And so what came to mind was my childhood. My childhood was very different from the average American. I was an Army brat. The best quote that I can think of that kind of sums up how I feel about my childhood was written on a small plaque that wherever we moved, we would hang above the kitchen door, the door to the living room. And on that plaque, it said, "Home is where the Army sends you." Now, it's kind of a cheesy quote, I know, but it's honestly how I felt. My father was raised in North Carolina, Germany for a while, and Maryland. My mother was raised in upstate New York, and I grew up in 10 different places: California, Saudi Arabia, Maryland, Colorado, Rhode Island, Virginia, Kansas, Boston, and Alaska. This gave me a very unique sense of the world. But more than that, it allowed me to realize the importance of the relationships, the people around you, your friends, and your family. I always identified living in the Army. Posts was the only thing I really lived on. And even though most of my friends grew up and came from different places, we all shared that Army, the things that it had in common. So one got very accustomed to having friends from all over the place and them leaving and having to make new friends the next year. I remember every summer growing up, I'd walk down the street and there'd be moving trucks in front of half the houses. And I'd walk down and see what friends I had that were gonna leave and what new kids were coming to town. The friends that I had grown up came and go. But I always knew that wherever I went, I could make new friends. And that kind of leads me to one big point of growing up as an Army brat, and that is the families are some of the most accepting families that you'll ever meet. The sense of community they have is extremely strong. I think back to the surge in Iraq around 2007. I was living on Fort Riley, Kansas, and almost every single dad on that street was deployed. The families had to bond together. They needed to. Some nights I'd go over to my friend's house and have dinner at their house and sleep over at their house because my mom was busy taking care of a family in the battalion. And then on other nights, my friends would come over to my house and they'd hang out for a couple hours because their parents were busy. One person that sticks out in my mind is Lieutenant Colonel Senstack. He lived about 5 doors down from me, and he was one of the few fathers left on the street. He took my best friend Ronnie and I one day and taught us how to fish. We were both about 10 years old. He taught me how to tie my first fishing knot, taught me how to catch trout, how to clean them, and how to cook them. And as a kid, I didn't really think anything of this at the time. But looking back, he was like family to me. As an Army brat, with my father deployed, my mother busy in the family readiness group is what it's called, taking care of the families of the battalion, and then also taking care of my brother and I, there's not a lot of time to leave post and go do things. So it's easy to stay on post for weeks at a time. And when you're a kid, it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. But you don't really realize how much you miss. My parents changed that for me. One thing they always did growing up was have mandatory fun, as it's like to called. And it was a huge part of my life. But it ended up being one of the best things of my childhood. They took us places. Whether it was some random town on a Sunday afternoon or driving from Massachusetts all the way up to Alaska. So One of my favorite stories about this mandatory fun was my trip from Kansas to the Grand Canyon. My parents showed up to school one day and picked my brother and I up and said, "Get in the car." And we drove 15 hours down to the Grand Canyon with 2 stops. My dad didn't like stopping. We got out of the car, pitched a tent, slept the night. My dad woke us up real early, probably around 5 or 6, and we hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, hiked back up, got in the truck, and left. It's things like that that I'll never forget. The Grand Canyon was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. But more than that, it was the time spent with my family, time spent with my father, who had been deployed for 15 months, and who I got to talk to twice during that time. Time to see my mom, who had been busy with the FRG. She had to be. So I think back to some of the things that being an Army brat's allowed me to do and experience. Before I was 15 years old, I'd already been to eat lobster in Maine, hiked the Grand Canyon, gone fly fishing in Colorado, toured New York City, picked lemons from a lemon tree in Saudi Arabia, tackled pigs in a rodeo in Kansas, gone skiing in the Rockies, eaten oysters in Boston, and so many more things. But more than experiencing these things was the people I was with, my friends, my family. Because no matter where I went, no matter how bad things got, no matter how long my dad was gone, and no matter how many different schools I had to go to, in the back of my head, I always knew it was going to be okay. Because if being an Army brat taught me anything, it's that the relationships, the friends you make, the people around you, your family, they can get you through anything. So in a profession like ours, future leaders in the Army, we have to make time to build those relationships, as my parents did for my brother and I. So if I can leave you with a few things, it's call your grandparents, visit your family for Thanksgiving, and remember to value the people around you no matter what. Thank you.